Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell picked up Grace Thornton's M14, turned it over in his hands like it was a museum piece and laughed. Not a polite laugh, a loud, deliberate laugh meant to carry across the entire staging area. "Gentlemen," he said, holding the rifle up for everyone to see, "we've got ourselves a history lesson, walking in with iron sights and a death wish." He set it down hard and walked away without looking at her once. If you've never been disrespected in front of people who were supposed to be your equals, you don't know what that silence feels like. But Grace Thornton knew, and she remembered every second of it. If this story hits something in your chest, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The registration table was set up inside a long corridor at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Boots clicked on polished concrete. The air smelled like gun oil, black coffee, and the kind of testosterone-driven competition that never fully announced itself, but was always present in the way men stood in the way they sized each other up without making eye contact in the half-second pause before a handshake. Grace Thornton walked in carrying a rifle case that had seen better decades. The latches were worn, the handle had been repaired with electrical tape at some point, black tape over older black tape. She set it down on the check-in table and unzipped her jacket with the calm, unhurried movement of a woman who had nowhere else she'd rather be and nothing left to prove to anyone she hadn't already proven it to. The sergeant behind the registration table looked at her name badge, looked at her, then looked down at his clipboard. "Captain Thornton, Marine Corps." "That's right." He found her name, checked the box, handed her a competitor packet. He said nothing unusual. But she caught the way his eyes went to the rifle case before she even touched it again. She found her assigned staging area at the far end of the row. 6 stations, 6 competitors. She set the case down and opened it carefully the way you open something you were taught to respect before you were taught anything else. The M14 lay inside on a bed of custom-cut foam that had molded to its shape over years of use. The rifle was old, Vietnam-era old. The woodstock had a hairline crack above the grip that had been filled, sanded, and refinished so many times it had its own history written in the grain. The iron sights were original, no rail, no scope mount, no modern attachments of any kind. "You're kidding me." She didn't turn around. She already knew the voice. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell, Navy SEAL, had been standing behind her for about 4 seconds before he decided to speak. She'd heard his boots. She'd clocked his reflection in the glass partition to her left. She kept her hands moving, checking the action running through her pre-competition inspection the way she'd been doing since she was 17 years old. "Is that a Vietnam rifle?" Mitchell said. He wasn't asking because he didn't know. He was asking because he wanted others to hear him ask. "It is," she said. "Iron sights." "Correct. On purpose." She looked up at him then, not with anger, not with challenge, just with patience, the particular patience of someone who has had this exact conversation 100 times and has learned that the best response to it is economy of words. "Yes, Lieutenant, on purpose." Mitchell stared at her for a moment, then broke into that laugh, the one that had already spread to 2 other men nearby, both of whom had been pretending not to watch. "All right," he said, backing away with his hands up in mock surrender. "All right, I respect the commitment to historical fiction." She said nothing. She went back to her inspection. But across the row, Commander Daniel Patterson had been watching. Patterson was not a man who laughed easily. He had 22 years in deep crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and a reputation for being precise in every way a person could be precise in shooting and speech in judgment. He watched Mitchell walk away. He watched Grace Thornton continue her inspection as if nothing had happened. He filed that away. The briefing that afternoon was run by Master Chief Jack Reeves, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of something harder than wood. He stood at the front of the room without notes, without a presentation, without anything but a voice that had the particular quality of a man who had given commands in places where being misunderstood could get someone killed. 3 days, Reeves has said. Day 1, 600 yards static. Day 2, moving targets, variable speed, no advance range time for any competitor. Day 3, field conditions announced 48 hours before. Final standings determine allocation recommendations for 4 special operations units. This is not a demonstration. This is not a training exercise. You are being evaluated. Any questions about format, see the scoring sheets in your packets. Any questions about conduct, see me directly. Are we clear? The room said yes, Master Chief, in the particular unison of people who didn't need to be told twice. Reeves looked out over the assembled competitors, 14 in total from 4 different branches, and his gaze moved without stopping, the way experienced evaluators scan a room not looking for anything specific, but capable of catching everything wrong. His eyes landed on Grace Thornton for exactly the same amount of time they landed on everyone else. Then the briefing was done. In the corridor, after the natural groupings formed the way they always did, SEALs together, Rangers together, the few Marines scattered between them, depending on who they knew. Grace had no natural group. She walked alone toward the armory check, reviewing her packet, and she was fine with that. She had always been fine with that. Being alone in a room had never frightened her the way it frightened people who needed the room's approval to feel certain of themselves. What she wasn't fine with was what happened 30 seconds later. Lieutenant David Chen fell into step beside her. Not aggressively, not with performance, just alongside. Chen was Marine like her, though they'd never served in the same unit. He was 31, slightly built, with the kind of quiet competence that only showed up in the details: how he carried his kit, how he'd positioned himself in the briefing room with sight lines to both exits, how he moved through a crowded corridor without bumping into anything. "The Mitchell thing," he said, not looking at her. "Don't let it—" "I didn't," she said. "I know, I'm saying for the next 3 days, because that was just the opening round." She looked at him sideways. "How long have you been here?" "Got in yesterday, dinner with the SEAL contingent last night, Patterson's table." He paused. "You came up." She stopped walking. "What do you mean I came up?" "I mean, Mitchell had opinions about the registration list, and he was not keeping them quiet." Chen turned to face her now, and his expression was careful in the way of someone delivering information they want received accurately. He said, and I'm giving you the direct quote, because you deserve the direct quote. He said, "Whoever approved that entry was drunk or desperate. And either way, the rest of us are going to spend 3 days babysitting a Marine with a museum piece who has no business being on the same range as real precision shooters." The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. "He said that at Patterson's table," Grace said. "Yes." And Patterson said— Chen's expression shifted just slightly. Patterson said nothing, which from what I understand about Patterson is either very good or very bad. Grace started walking again. "It's neither," she said. "It means he's watching." She was right. Patterson was watching. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was exactly what he was watching for. That night in the competitor barracks, Grace went through her evening routine with the discipline of someone who understood that mental preparation was not optional. She cleaned the M14 with the same cloth her father had used. She still had it worn thin in the middle, the original color long since faded into something unidentifiable. She went through the technical adjustments she'd need to account for prevailing wind direction off the Pacific, the temperature differential between morning and afternoon at the range, the specific way iron sights required your body to be in perfect alignment every single time because there was no mechanical system compensating for your errors. She laid the rifle back in its case and sat on the edge of her bunk. On the inside lid of the case, held in place by a thin strip of contact paper that had been replaced 3 times over the years, was a photograph. Black and white, the edges soft with age. A young man in Marine dress uniform, standing straight, looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of someone who believed in what he was doing, even if he understood completely what it might cost. Sergeant First Class William Thornton. Her father. Vietnam, 1968. She touched the edge of the photograph without pressing on. She never pressed on it, and then she closed the case. She had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days. Not from anxiety, from preparation. There was a difference, and she knew the difference, and she wanted to be certain that whatever happened in the next 72 hours, it wasn't going to be her body that let her down. She was asleep in 11 minutes. At 600, the range opened. The first thing Grace noticed when she arrived at her assigned lane was that the ammunition case she'd staged the night before was sitting at a different angle than she'd left it. Not dramatically different, not obviously tampered with, just slightly rotated, the kind of thing 99 people out of 100 would never catch. She caught it. She opened the case and counted her rounds. She counted them twice because the first count didn't match what she'd logged into her staging sheet. 15 rounds short. She stood very still for a moment. The range was filling around her boots on gravel gear, being checked the particular metallic sounds of 14 precision rifles being handled by people who knew exactly what they were doing. She looked down at the case. She looked at the staging sheet. She counted one more time, 15 short. She did not say anything. She picked up her tablet, opened her competitor log, and made a timestamp note of the discrepancy. Then she went to find the range officer. The range officer was a Navy warrant officer named Galloway, who had the slightly haunted look of a man who had learned that every problem that came to him before 700 was going to be complicated. He listened to Grace without interrupting. He looked at her tablet. He looked at her staging sheet. "Could be a miscount during issue," he said. "It's not," she said. "I counted at staging. I have the sheet." Galloway looked at the sheet. Then he looked around the range, the way you look around when you want to see if anyone is watching, and then back at her. "I'll file an equipment discrepancy report. I'd like it on record now. It will be on record, with a timestamp before the day's shooting begins." Something moved across Galloway's face. Not guilt, not exactly. More like recognition. The recognition of a man who suddenly understood that the woman standing in front of him was not going to let this become something that could be dismissed after the fact. "Yes, Captain. Timestamp now." She thanked him. She walked back to her lane. She had lost exactly 7 minutes of preparation time, and she used the remaining 3 before the range opened to stand at her lane without touching anything, breathing slowly, looking at the 600-yard target as if she were already in conversation with it. Captain Bradley Anderson appeared at the lane beside hers. Anderson was Army Ranger, 43 years old, and carried the particular authority of a man who had stopped needing to prove himself roughly a decade ago. He glanced over at her. "You the one who had an equipment issue?" "Word travels fast," she said without looking away from the target. "On a range this small, everything travels fast." He settled into his lane, adjusting his position with the comfortable efficiency of long habit. "Iron sights," he said. It wasn't a question or a judgment. It was an observation. "Yes. My grandfather shot iron sights in Korea." He paused. "He was a better shot than most men I've known who had everything money could buy in glass and electronics." She looked at him then. He was looking downrange, not at her. "Good luck, Captain." "You too, sir." The range officer's voice came over the speaker. "Competitors ready positions." 14 shooters moved into position. The range fell into the particular quiet that exists just before precision. Shooting begins, a silence that has texture, that has weight, that every serious marksman recognizes as the moment where everything that isn't relevant simply stops existing. Grace settled into her prone position behind the M14. She adjusted her body, hips, shoulders, the angle of her neck by fractions that added up to everything. She found her natural point of aim by closing her eyes, relaxing completely, then opening them and seeing where the sights were naturally oriented. She adjusted 3 more times until the target sat perfectly in the iron sight picture without her muscles having to hold it there. She breathed. In. Inhale, we don't know. Range is hot. Competitors fire at will. The first shots from the SEAL lanes were almost instantaneous. Mitchell's ballistic computer system was running. His scope was dialed and his first round broke clean. Down the line, the sounds of precision rifle fire created a rhythm. Controlled, measured the sound of people who were very good at something doing that thing in optimal conditions. Grace waited, not from hesitation, from certainty. She was waiting for the wind to cycle through to the moment she'd been reading for the last 90 seconds. The wind at 600 yards didn't blow in a straight line. It layered, shifted, created pockets that experienced shooters could learn to feel rather than calculate. She felt it. She pressed the trigger. The shot broke so cleanly that she was already calling it good before the bullet reached the target. Hit. She cycled the action without rushing, found her natural point of aim again, waited for her breath to settle, read the wind. It had shifted 2 degrees left. She made the adjustment in her body position, not in any external mechanism because there was no external mechanism, just bone and muscle and discipline. Second shot, hit. Third shot, hit. At this point, something changed in the range. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. But Grace had spent enough time in competitive shooting environment to know what a range sounds like when people stop paying full attention to their own shooting and start paying attention to someone else's. The rhythm of fire around her shifted slightly. Some shots came a fraction of a second later than they should have. Someone cleared their throat. Fourth shot, hit. Fifth shot. She paused on this one. The wind had done something unusual, shifted back toward its original direction, but with less force, creating a moment of relative calm that would not last more than 2 or 3 seconds. A 2-second window at 600 yards with iron sights. She was already pressing when the window opened. Hit. 5 rounds. 5 perfect hits. The group when scored would turn out to be the tightest cluster of the morning session, tighter than any scoped rifle on the range. The range officer called a ceasefire for scoring. Competitors stood up from their positions. Mitchell was looking at his tablet, the real-time scoring feed. She saw his expression go through something complicated. He controlled it fast the way trained people control things, but it wasn't fast enough. "Fluke," he said to the man next to him, not quite quietly enough. Patterson, who had shot his own clean group and was standing calmly 3 lanes down, said, without looking up from his own scoring sheet, 5 shots, same point of impact. That's not a fluke, Mitchell. That's a method. The range went quiet in a very specific way. Mitchell said nothing. Grace said nothing. But something had shifted, and everyone standing on that range could feel it in their chest, even if they couldn't have explained exactly what it was. She had been dismissed before she fired a shot. She had just made it very difficult to dismiss her again. But as she walked back to the staging area to note her scores and prepare for the afternoon session, she passed the row of equipment cases and noticed something she hadn't noticed that morning. A padlock on her case that she hadn't put there. Her own lock was sitting slightly to the side, not latched. Someone had been in her case. Again. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to feel what she felt, the spike of anger, the cold recognition that this was deliberate and this was organized and this was someone who was willing to go further than mockery. Then she put the feeling in the place she kept feelings during competition, and she went to find Galloway. Because someone wanted her out of this competition. And the only response to that, the only response her father had ever taught her, was to stay in it. To stay in it so well that getting her out became impossible. To shoot so cleanly, so precisely, so undeniably, that the people trying to remove her would have to do it in broad daylight where everyone could see exactly what they were doing. She would not make it easy for them. She would make it the hardest thing they had ever attempted. And the afternoon session hadn't even started. The scoring sheets from morning that went up on the board at 1300 hours. 14 names, 14 scores. The numbers told a story that no one in the room could entirely ignore, and several people in the room were very clearly trying to ignore it. Grace Thornton, 5 for 5. Perfect group. Top score of the morning session. Mitchell stood in front of that board for longer than necessary. Anderson walked past, glanced at it, walked on without reaction. Chen found Grace at the water station near the staging area and said quietly, "You see the board?" "I saw it." Mitchell's going to say something. He already has. I mean something with more edge than this morning. She looked at Chen. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she knew that what was coming wasn't going to be just words. The missing rounds, the case lock, the staging disturbance, none of that was random, and none of it was over. "Then let him," she said. "Grace." "David." She said his name the way you say a friend's name when you're asking them to trust your judgment. "I've been handling Ryan Mitchell my entire career. They just keep putting him in different uniforms." Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled. "That's probably the most honest thing anyone said on this range in 3 days." She picked up her water, checked the time, and started walking back toward her lane. The afternoon session was 45 minutes away. The wind was picking up off the water. There was a low-pressure system sitting offshore that the meteorology briefing had mentioned in passing, the kind of thing that could be irrelevant or could become very relevant depending on how quickly it moved. Grace had been watching the sky since she arrived. She already had a theory about day 3. She didn't share it with anyone. The afternoon session started at 13:45 hours, and Grace was already in position at 13:38. Not because the rules required it, because she needed 7 minutes of stillness before the first round went downrange. 7 minutes to let her nervous system settle into the particular calm that her father had called going to the quiet place. He'd said it the first time she shot with him at age 12, and she'd spent the next 26 years learning exactly what he meant by it. You didn't find the quiet place by thinking about it. You found it by stopping thinking entirely and letting your body remember what it already knew. She was in it now. Mitchell wasn't. She could hear him from 3 lanes over talking to the scoring officer about a calibration issue with his ballistic computer, his voice carrying that specific edge of a man who was frustrated but performing confidence over the frustration. Just run the reset sequence again. It did this at Quantico too. The humidity's messing with the sensor. The scoring officer said something Grace couldn't hear. Mitchell said, "I know what the manual says. I'm telling you what it actually does." She kept her eyes downrange. At exactly 13:45, Galloway's voice came over the speaker. "Afternoon session static, target 600 yards. Competitors, ready positions." The sounds of 14 people settling into shooting positions was something Grace had come to find almost meditative over the years. The specific sequence of adjustments, the final clearing of throat, the exhale that serious shooters do before the world narrows down to the distance between them and a target. Range is hot. She didn't fire immediately. Neither did Anderson. She noticed he had the same habit she did, waiting for the first few seconds to pass, reading the air, confirming what the pre-session observation had told him. Most of the other competitors fired within the first 10 seconds. Mitchell's first shot came at about 8 seconds. She heard it. She heard a half beat later the sound of a spotter calling the hit solid center mass good shot. He hadn't let the computer malfunction rattle him. She gave him credit for that. She pressed her first round at 17 seconds. Hit. The afternoon light was different from the morning. The sun had moved to a position that created a shimmer effect at around 400 yards, the kind of heat mirage that played tricks with optical systems but had no effect on iron sights because iron sights didn't magnify. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was real. Second round. Hit. Third round. She felt the wind shift, a gust that had more energy than the base wind, coming in at an angle that would push the bullet about 3 inches left at 600 yards if she didn't account for it. She waited. The gust wasn't steady, it pulsed, which meant there was a gap coming. She read the grass at the 300-yard mark, watched a piece of range tape flutter, counted the rhythm. There. The gap. She pressed. Hit. Down the line, she heard Mitchell say something sharp and quiet to himself. She didn't look. She cycled the action and found her position again. Mitchell's scope fogged, Chen said that evening at the long table where competitors ate together out of logistical necessity, if not social preference. He said it without satisfaction, just as information. The humidity hit it at exactly the wrong time during afternoon session. Cost him 2 points. 2 points matters, Anderson said. He was eating slowly the way men eat when they're thinking about something other than food. Every point matters, Patterson said. He was at the end of the table, and he said it without looking up from the small notebook he was writing in. Patterson kept handwritten notes. Grace had noticed that in the briefing room, had noticed it again on the range. In a world where everyone else had tablets and apps and digital scoring systems, Patterson used a narrow spiral notebook and a mechanical pencil. Especially on day one, when the conditions are optimal and every mistake is entirely your own. Mitchell said, "The fog was equipment failure. It's documented." "It is," Patterson said. He turned a page in his notebook. "And the scoring system documents it as a miss." The table went quiet the way tables go quiet when someone has said something accurate that nobody wanted said out loud. Grace was looking at her food. She felt Chen's attention on her. He was watching to see if she'd react, or if Mitchell would redirect toward her. Mitchell didn't. He picked up his coffee and stared at the wall and did the private recalculation that competitive people do when the scoreboard doesn't match what they expected. It was Anderson who spoke next, and he aimed it at Grace with the directness of someone who had decided to stop pretending he wasn't curious. "Thornton, the natural point of aim, you're resetting completely between shots." "Yes." "No adjustment from the previous position?" "No, fresh every time. Anderson considered this. "That's slower." "By about 2 seconds per shot," she agreed, "but the group is tighter. Because every shot starts from the same place instead of building on the drift from the previous one." Anderson set down his fork. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been shown a technique he'd never considered because the technology he'd relied on had made the technique seem unnecessary. "Your father teach you that?" The table, which had been returning to its normal ambient noise level, went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. "Yes," she said. Anderson nodded slowly. What branch? Marine, Vietnam. Another beat of quiet. Anderson looked down at his tray. He said, good man then, in the way that people from that generation say it, not as a compliment exactly, but as an acknowledgement of something that costs something. Grace said. Mitchell across the table had been listening. She could tell by the angle of his head. He said nothing, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly, and she filed it away. At 2100 hours, Grace did her evening rifle check and discovered the second tampering. It wasn't the ammunition this time. The ammunition was counted correct logged. What she found was subtler. Her rear sight aperture had been adjusted. Not dramatically, not enough that a casual check would catch it. Just enough that if she didn't catch it, her shots would drift consistently right by approximately 4 to 6 inches at 600 yards. At 1,000 yards, the drift would be catastrophic. She sat with that information for a full minute. Someone had touched her rifle. Someone had access to the staging area after hours, which meant either a competitor with enough authority to move past the posted schedule, or someone with a key to the compound who was acting on behalf of a competitor, or something worse, an inside player, someone embedded in the administrative structure of the competition itself. She took out her adjustment tool and corrected the sight to its original setting. She had the original setting memorized. She'd measured and recorded it the night before arrival, following a habit her father had drilled into her. Always know your baseline, always be able to return to it, always assume that any environment you didn't fully control could be used against you. He'd learned that in Hugh City. She thought about him now sitting on the edge of her bunk with the rifle across her knees, her hands still on the stock. William Thornton had never once complained to her about Vietnam, not the heat, not the fear, not what he'd seen. What he'd told her was the craft, the specific, unglamorous, demanding craft of precision, shooting in conditions that were designed to make precision impossible. Rain, smoke, darkness. The sounds of combat around you pulling at your attention like hands grabbing at your jacket while you tried to concentrate. The rifle doesn't care how scared you are, he'd told her once. She was 15. They were on the range behind their property in rural Virginia, and she had just missed 3 shots in a row because her hands were shaking from cold. It doesn't care how cold you are, or how tired you are, or who's watching you, or what they think. It has one job. Your job is to be steady enough to let it do that job. Everything else, the fear, the cold, the opinions, that's noise. You learn to put noise where it belongs. Where does it belong? She'd asked. He'd looked at her with those eyes that had seen Hugh City and come back from it somehow intact, and he'd said, somewhere you can find it later if you need it, but somewhere it can't find you first. She hadn't fully understood that until her 3rd deployment. Now she understood it completely. She made one more notation in her log. The sight adjustment, the measurement of deviation, the time of discovery, and then she did something she had been calculating since morning. She went to find Master Chief Reeves. It was 21:30. Reeves was in the administrative office at the end of the barracks block, and she could see through the narrow window beside the door that he was working at his desk alone. She knocked twice. Enter. She came in, closed the door, and put her log on his desk without preamble. She pointed to the 3 entries, the missing ammunition in the morning, the case lock disturbance, the rear sight adjustment. Reeves read them in the order she'd indicated. His face did not change. This was either very good or very bad, and she'd had enough of the day's uncertainty to decide it was time to find out which. Master Chief, I need you to tell me whether this competition has a mechanism for investigating equipment interference or whether I'm managing this alone. Reeves looked up from the log. His eyes were the color of old iron, and they held a quality that Grace had learned to recognize in men who had been in genuinely dangerous places, a steadiness that wasn't calm, exactly more like a surface that had been compressed under too much pressure for too many years to be rattled by the things that rattled ordinary people. How confident are you in these notations? He said. 100% on the ammunition count. I have the original staging sheet. 95% on the case lock. I could have been wrong about the angle, but I don't think I was. 100% on the sight. I measured the original setting before arrival, and again tonight. Someone moved it precisely 4 clicks right. Reeves said nothing for a moment. Then, sit down, Captain. She sat. I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Yes, Master Chief. Do you have any idea who did this? She looked at him directly. I have a list of people with motive and opportunity. I'm not going to give you speculation. What I want from you is a security response." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. She listened to his side of it. He asked for the overnight security log for the staging area. He asked specifically for entry timestamps between 1900 and 2100. He said no tonight, now. He hung up. "The log will be reviewed," he said, "and my equipment. Your staging area will have a dedicated security assignment for the remainder of the competition." Something in her chest loosened just slightly, not relief, more like the specific satisfaction of knowing that the problem was now on record in a place where it couldn't be quietly buried. "Thank you, Master Chief." She stood to go. "Thornton," she stopped. "The sight adjustment," Reeves said. 4 clicks right. You caught that?" "Yes. Most shooters, even good ones, wouldn't have caught that before the first shot." She didn't say anything. "How did you know the original setting so precisely?" "My father taught me to measure everything I was going to depend on before I needed to depend on it." She paused. "He said the time to know your equipment isn't when you're under fire. It's before." Reeves held her gaze for one more second. Then he looked back down at his desk. "Good night, Captain." She walked back to her barracks in the dark, and the low-pressure system off the coast had moved closer while she was inside. She could feel it in the air, that specific heaviness, that pressure differential that precedes serious weather. She stood outside for a moment and looked at the sky, and she thought about what Day 3 conditions might mean for 14 shooters with 14 different systems. She went inside and slept 4 hours. Day 2 began at 700 with a briefing that lasted 8 minutes. Galloway stood in front of the assembled competitors and delivered the day's format in the flat factual cadence of someone who had no personal investment in how people felt about what he was saying. Moving targets. Variable speed between 3 and 12 miles per hour. Target profiles, partial exposure, full exposure, mixed pattern. No advance range time for any competitor. Scoring first round hits only. Glancing hits are scored as misses. You have 10 rounds per lane. Minimum qualifying score is 6. Questions. Mitchell raised his hand. What's the target movement pattern? Random or programmed? Randomized by a computer before each lane session. No 2 lanes will run the same pattern. So there's no way to read it in advance. Correct. Mitchell put his hand down. Grace watched him absorb this. She watched the small recalculation happen the way his confidence in his ballistic system flickered for just a fraction of a second, because the system was optimized for precise input data and randomized movement patterns were by definition imprecise input data. You couldn't calculate a solution for a problem that hadn't been defined yet. You could only react to it. She had been reacting to undefined problems since she was 17. The morning session on Day 2 was a different creature entirely from the static shooting of Day 1. Static targets had an almost meditative quality. The long exhale, the patience, the communion between shooter and known distance. Moving targets were something else. Moving targets required a shooter to be alive in a different way, present adaptive reading and recalibrating in real time with no opportunity to pause between the decision and the action. Grace stepped into her lane at 0830 for the first rotation. The target appeared at 600 yards, moving left to right at what she estimated immediately as about 6 miles per hour, medium speed manageable, but the movement was not perfectly smooth. There was a slight variation in it, the mechanical imperfection of the target system itself, and that imperfection was its own kind of information. She tracked it. She didn't try to calculate ahead. She felt the rhythm of the movement, the way a musician feels the rhythm of a piece, not intellectually, not analytically, but in the body, in the hands, in the part of the nervous system that exists below conscious thought. She pressed, hit. The target changed speed. Now faster, she estimated 9 miles per hour. It also changed direction, moving right to left. The shift was designed to break the shooter's rhythm to force a recalculation. For a computer-assisted system, the recalculation was automatic and nearly instantaneous. For a human shooter with iron sights, the recalculation had to happen in the body. She tracked. She felt the new rhythm establish itself. She pressed, hit. Target went to partial exposure, only the upper quarter visible, still moving. This was the kind of shot that eliminated a significant number of competitive shooters because the precision required was calibrated against a much smaller margin for error, while the fundamental challenge of the movement remained unchanged. She pressed, hit. 3 for 3 when Galloway called the lane pause for a scoring check. She stood up, shook her shoulders, loosed the tension that accumulates in a prone position as specific and real, and looked downrange at the target system. Chen was 2 lanes over, also 3 for 3. He caught her eye and gave a small nod. Not celebratory, informational. Mitchell, she could tell from the sound of his lane, was struggling. She wasn't watching him. She was focused on her own lane. But competitive shooters develop a background awareness of the range around them. A peripheral reading of the sonic environment in what she was hearing from Mitchell's lane was the particular rhythm of someone who was compensating rather than flowing. 2 hits, then a pause, then the distinctive sound of a frustrated exhale, then a 3rd hit. He was working hard for what should have come naturally. The second rotation was harder. Speed variation increased. Target profiles got more complex. 2 targets moving in opposite directions, simultaneously requiring the shooter to transition between them without losing the tracking rhythm on either. Grace hit 7 of her first 8 on the second rotation, and then on the 9th, felt the crosswind change character in a way that suggested the offshore system was pushing ahead of its predicted timeline. She made a mid-shot adjustment, something that required overriding the muscle memory of the tracking rhythm she'd established, and was a 1/4 inch off the edge of the scoring zone. Glancing hit, scored as a miss. She stood up from the lane, took a breath, noted it. 1 miss, not because she'd shot poorly, because the conditions had changed faster than the established rhythm could accommodate. She filed that information as data about what day 3 was likely to bring. The final scores for day 2 afternoon session went up at 1700 hours. Grace Thornton, 9 for 10, tied with Chen, better than everyone else on the range except Anderson, who had shot 9 for 10 as well, with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who had been doing this specific thing for 2 decades. Mitchell had shot 7 for 10. Still qualifying, still competitive. But the gap between where he'd expected to be and where he was had widened into something visible. Patterson had shot 8 for 10 and had said nothing to anyone about it, which somehow made it feel more significant than if he'd said a great deal. Grace was washing her hands in the competitor bathroom when she heard Mitchell's voice in the corridor outside. He was talking to someone, and he wasn't being careful about volume. I'm telling you, the pattern on her lane was different. The randomization was lighter. A second voice, she didn't recognize it. That's not how the system works. I know how the system works. I've shot this format before. Her targets were moving slower on average. Mitchell, the computer ran the same. Then pull the logs and show me. A pause. Pull the logs, Mitchell said again. His voice had dropped, but the edge in it had sharpened. Because I want to see the variance data for every lane, and I want to see it before tomorrow morning. Because if there's an anomaly in the randomization, I have the right to know. Silence. Then the second voice, quieter. I'll look at it. Grace dried her hands. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment, looking at herself, not checking her appearance, just being present with herself, which was something her father had also taught her, the value of looking yourself in the eye at the end of a hard day and taking an honest accounting. The accounting was this: someone had tried to sabotage her equipment and failed because she'd prepared for it. Someone was now trying to challenge the scoring system, looking for an angle to invalidate what couldn't be dismissed outright. The competition was not just happening on the range. It never had been. She thought about what Reeves had said. You caught that. Yes, she had. But catching things was getting more complicated because the tactics were evolving. Whoever was behind this had started with crude interference, missing ammunition, adjusted sights, and was now moving toward systemic challenge, questioning the integrity of the range itself. That was a more dangerous game. Not because she couldn't defend against it, but because it meant that simply shooting well was no longer sufficient. She would have to shoot so well, so far beyond any reasonable challenge, that no systemic argument could stand against the weight of what the scorecard said. She turned off the bathroom light and went to find Reeves again. He was already looking at the security log when she knocked. He didn't say good evening. He said, the entry log shows an access at 2034 last night. Competitor's general key, we can't tell which one without the individual logs, and those are encoded with a delay. I'll have the individual data by 0600. By 0600, she said, after day 3 begins. The delay is a security protocol I can't override. She looked at him. He looked at her. Both of them knew what the other was calculating. Then I need my equipment in a secured case tonight, she said. Personal custody. I keep it with me. Reeves considered this for exactly 2 seconds. That's outside standard procedure. So is adjusting a competitor's rear sight without authorization. Another 2-second pause. Then Reeves reached into his desk drawer and produced a small combination lock as heavy kind, the kind that required serious effort to defeat without a cutter. He held it out to her. The combination is 1968. If you change it, log the new combination with me before 0600. She took the lock. She understood without him saying it why he'd chosen that number. 1968, the year of Hugh City, the year her father had done what he'd done. Reeves knew more than he'd let on. She walked back to her barracks with her rifle case on her shoulder, the combination lock in her pocket, and the offshore weather system pressing down on everything with the particular patience of weather that knows it has already decided what it's going to do. She sat down on her bunk and pulled out the photograph from inside the case lid, her father young in dress uniform, looking directly at the camera. "They're trying to move me out," she said quietly, not quite to herself. She'd talked to him that way since she was 24, since the first deployment, since she'd stopped having the option of calling him on the phone and had started carrying him the only other way she knew how. "I'm not moving," she said. She put the photograph back. She attached the lock. She set the combination and said the number out loud once quietly, like a word in a language only she and one other person had ever spoken. 1968. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it against the window. Not violent yet, just persistent, the way serious weather always announces itself before it arrives. Tomorrow was day 3. She was ready. The 0600 brief on day 3 began with Master Chief Reeves walking into the room and saying 4 words before anyone had finished their coffee. "Weather has moved up." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds while 14 competitors recalibrated everything they thought they knew about the day ahead. The offshore system arrived 6 hours ahead of meteorological projection. Current conditions at range sustained in winds 38 miles per hour, gusting to 44. Horizontal precipitation, visibility at 1,000 yards is degraded approximately 60%. Temperature drop of 11 degrees from yesterday's session. He paused. Day 3 proceeds as scheduled. The room reacted in the way rooms react when the information delivered is worse than anyone was willing to admit they'd feared. Not panic. These were not people who panicked, but the specific recalibration that happens when the conditions you trained for have been replaced by conditions that test something deeper than training. Mitchell, 2 seats to her left, leaned forward and put both elbows on the table. Anderson exhaled very slowly through his nose. Chen, beside Grace, went completely still in the way he did when he was running calculations inside himself that he wasn't going to share with anyone. Patterson looked up from his notebook and then looked directly at Grace. She was the only person in the room who had not visibly reacted. Not because she wasn't processing what Reeves had said. She was processing it completely, running the numbers on what 44-mile-per-hour gusts would do to a bullet at 600 yards, at 800, at 1,000 beyond. Running the numbers on what horizontal precipitation would do to optical systems, to electronics, to anything that depended on clarity for its function. Running the numbers on what it would do to iron sights, which depended on nothing except the shooter's eye and the shooter's discipline. She had been running those numbers since the night before when she'd heard the wind against her window and understood what the offshore system was going to bring. She just hadn't needed to show it on her face. Reeves continued. Format for day 3, distance progressive static targets. 600 yards, 800, 1,000, 1,200. 5 rounds per distance. Conditions are uniform across all lanes. Scoring is standard. The range opens at 00800. Any questions? Mitchell raised his hand. What's the operational call if a competitor's system goes down due to weather? Competitor continues with available equipment or withdraws. There is no equipment pause provision in the day 3 format. That's in the regulations. Page 14, Rovitschima said, Section 4, subsection C. It's been in the regulations since this competition was established. He looked at Mitchell with the expression of a man who had anticipated this exact question. Anything else? Silence away for you. 0800, Reeves said, and left the room. Mitchell turned to the man beside him immediately. My system can handle this. The housing is rated to IP67. It's waterproof. Waterproof isn't the issue, the man said. Grace recognized him, Lieutenant Kowalski, another SEAL, one of the quieter ones. Wind at 44 is going to affect the ballistic calculation no matter what the housing rating is. The input data is going to be dirty. The gyroscopic correction will compensate. Up to a point. My system's point is higher than yours. Kowalski said nothing. Grace picked up her coffee, finished it, and stood to go prepare her equipment. As she stood, Patterson's voice came from the end of the table, quiet and even as always. Thornton? She looked at him. Yesterday, I requested the lane variance logs from the scoring officer. He said it without emphasis, without drama, the way a man states a fact that he wants on the record. The randomization data was consistent across all lanes. I submitted that finding to Reeves at 2200 hours. The table had gone quiet. Mitchell was looking at Patterson with the expression of a man trying to determine whether he'd just been helped or condemned. I thought you should know, Patterson said. He looked back down at his notebook. Grace held his gaze for 1 second after he looked away. Then she said, "Thank you, Commander," and walked out. Behind her, she heard the very deliberate silence of 14 people not saying what they were thinking. At 07:42, Grace arrived at her staging area and found something that stopped her cold. Her rifle case was exactly where she'd left it. The combination lock was intact. But sitting on top of the case placed there deliberately was a single photograph. Black and white, printed on standard paper, clearly a copy of something scanned from an original. A young man in marine dress uniform, standing straight, looking directly at the camera. Her father. She picked it up with hands that were steadier than she expected them to be, which told her something about how far she'd come in the 24 hours since she'd last looked at the original inside the case lid. On the back of the copy, written in pencil and handwriting, she didn't recognize Hugh City 1968. We remember. She stood with that photograph for a long moment. The wind was audible, even inside the staging area, the deep, persistent pressure of serious weather pushing against every surface it encountered. Someone knew about her father's record. Someone had gone to the trouble of finding a photograph, printing a copy, placing it here before 0742 on day 3. That was either a message of support or a message of intimidation, and the handwriting told her nothing about which one it was. She put the photograph inside her jacket against her chest and opened the combination lock. The M14 was exactly as she'd left it. She checked the sight settings still correct. She loaded her first magazine, checked the action twice, and ran her hands over every surface of the rifle the way her father had shown her feeling for anything that wasn't right, the way a surgeon's hands feel for something a scan might miss. Everything was right. She attached the magazine, shouldered the rifle once without firing, found her cheek. Weld confirmed the sight picture and set it back in the case. 0800 came with the wind hitting its stride. Grace stepped to her lane and felt it immediately, not just the physical pressure of the air, but the layering of it, the way serious wind isn't a single force, but a collection of forces, moving at slightly different speeds and angles, creating pockets and eddies that a shooter had to read in real time. The range had been set up with a crosswind component from the left, but the gusts were coming in at an angle that rotated that component, sometimes pushing towards straight-on headwind, sometimes shifting hard to a quartering crosswind that would push a bullet's trajectory significantly to the right at range. At 600 yards, the drift on a full-value crosswind at this speed was manageable with proper hold-off. At 1,000 yards, it was a different conversation entirely. At 1,200 yards in these conditions, with gusts spiking to 44, the drift could exceed 24 inches. Without proper compensation, and proper compensation required reading each gust individually rather than applying a single average correction. No mechanical system could do that. No scope could tell you what the next gust was going to do. Only a shooter who had learned to feel the wind in the body and the hands and the part of the nervous system her father called the place below thought could read it fast enough to act on it. She was already reading it. Range is hot, Galloway's voice said over the speaker, slightly distorted by the wind noise. Competitors fire at will. The first shots from the line were immediate. The top competitors weren't hesitating, weren't showing weakness, weren't giving the weather the dignity of intimidating them. She heard Mitchell's system engage. She heard Anderson's first round break clean. She heard Chen's shot, and from 200 yards to her right, he missed one of the younger competitors whose first round sailed left in a gust that he'd read half a second too late. Grace fired her first round at 600 yards. Hit. She had held 8 inches into the wind for that shot, trusting the read she'd done in the 40 seconds before the range went hot. The wind had cooperated, the gust had lapsed exactly when she'd pressed. She didn't celebrate. She cycled, found her position, read the wind flag at 300 yards, read the grass at the midpoint, felt the pressure on her left ear change slightly and waited. The next gust was coming. She could feel it building. She waited for it to peak and begin to lapse. She pressed. Hit. 2 for 2 at 600. She heard in the sonic texture of the range that at least 2 competitors had already missed at 600, the absence of a spotter. Call the sound of a shooter repositioning with the specific energy of someone who had not expected to miss and was now dealing with the fact that they had. At 800 yards, the conversation changed. The 800-yard target was almost invisible in the horizontal precipitation. Not because the target wasn't there, but because at that distance in these conditions, the human eye without magnification was seeing through a filter of moving water and wind-driven air distortion that compressed detail into suggestion. With a scope, you could cut through that to some degree. With iron sights, you saw what the conditions allowed you to see. What they allowed her to see was enough. She'd shot 800 yards in reduced visibility before. Not this reduced, not with this much lateral force, but the principle was the same. When you can't see perfectly, you shoot from what you know rather than what you can currently observe. You know the target is at 800 yards. You know the wind value at this moment based on everything you have been reading for the last 20 minutes. You know your holdover. You know your body's position. You shoot from the intersection of those knowns. She pressed. The shot surprised her slightly. There was a last-second gust shift that she caught at the edge of awareness and compensated for almost without thinking a micro-adjustment that happened below the level of conscious decision. Hit. She heard a very distinct sound from Mitchell's lane, the sound of his system alarming. A short, sharp electronic tone that cut through the wind noise. Then silence. Then his voice controlled but strained. Systems down. Ballistic computer is down. She kept her eyes downrange. Kowalski, Mitchell said. Kowalski, my system just crashed. I know, Kowalski said from the adjacent lane. Mine's running on backup. The wind sensor's reading garbage. It's throwing errors in the calculation chain. Can I run manual? What scope do you have behind the glass? A TACR. 18 power. In this rain, you're going to be shooting through a smear. I know, Mitchell said. I know that. A beat of silence. Then Mitchell said something that Grace did not expect to hear from Ryan Mitchell in any context ever. How does Thornton do it? The wind read. How does she? She feels it, Kowalski said. That's not an answer. It's the only answer there is. Grace pressed her 4th round at 800 yards. Hit. She heard Mitchell's next shot go. He'd switched to manual, and his technique was sound. She had to acknowledge that, but the scope at high magnification and horizontal rain was fighting him. The shot hit the edge of the scoring zone. It counted. He was adapting. But adapting was not the same as being prepared. The 1,000-yard line was announced at 09:34, and by then the weather had intensified by a margin that nobody on the range was pretending was comfortable. The wind had clocked slightly, adding a new component to the crosswind equation. The precipitation had increased. The temperature had dropped 2 more degrees from what Reeves had stated at the 0600 brief. Several competitors were struggling visibly. One had withdrawn a ranger whose scope had fogged internally, an equipment failure that no amount of skill could compensate for. 2 others were taking significantly longer between shots, running the slower mental calculations of shooters who had lost faith in their equipment and were trying to rebuild confidence from scratch in real time under the worst conditions of the competition. Grace was not struggling. She was in the quiet place. She had found it somewhere around the 3rd shot at 800 yards, and she had not left it since. The cold was real. Her hands were cold. Her face was cold. The condensation on the rifle's metal surfaces was cold against her cheek, but cold had no authority in the quiet place. The wind was real. The noise was real. The pressure was real, but none of it had access to the part of her that was doing the work. She was below all of it, in the calm center of a storm that was doing its level best to undo everyone on the range. She fired her first round at 1,000 yards. She knew before the spotter call that it was a hit. The shot had broken exactly the way she'd intended at exactly the moment she'd chosen the wind, having done exactly what she'd read it doing in the 4 seconds before she pressed. The call confirmed it. Hit, Alpha range, 1,000 yards. She heard the reaction move through the range like a wave. Not cheers, these were professional shooters, not a crowd, but the particular sound of people who have just witnessed something recalibrating their expectations. At 1,000 yards in current conditions with iron sights. Hit. Second round at 1,000. She waited longer. On this one, the wind was being less predictable, cycling through a pattern that didn't have a clean interval. She read the flags, read the grass, felt the pressure change on her left cheek, waited for the data to converge into a moment she could trust. It took 41 seconds. She pressed. Hit. That's 2 for 2 at 1,000, O'Galloway's voice said over the speaker. Range condition update, sustained wind now 41 miles per hour, gusting to 46. She heard someone say quietly but clearly from 3 lanes over, "Who the hell is she?" She didn't know who said it. It didn't matter. She cycled the action and found her position for the third round. Patterson, who was shooting from the lane at her far left, was the only competitor whose performance had remained completely consistent through the entire morning. He'd shot clean groups at 600 and 800, and now at 1,000 he was working with the same steady, unhurried precision that Grace had noticed from the first day. His scope was fogging. She could see him clearing it between shots, but he was managing it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned not to fight his equipment, but to work around its failures. At one point between shots, Patterson looked over at her, not to check her progress, to acknowledge it. The look lasted half a second, but it was the look that experienced professionals give each other when they recognize that something real is happening, not competitive acknowledgement, but something rarer and more honest than that. The recognition of craft. She gave him a small nod. He returned to his scope. Third round at 1,000 yards. Hit. She had 3 rounds left for the 1,000-yard targets, and then 5 for the 1,200-yard final distance, and she was aware without having checked any scoreboard, without having asked anyone, that she was shooting the best round on the range. She could tell from the sound of it. The sonic structure of a range has a kind of narrative, and if you know how to read it, the narrative tells you exactly where everyone stands. What it was telling her now was that she was ahead, significantly ahead, and that at 1,200 yards in these conditions, that lead was either going to become insurmountable or it was going to mean nothing at all, because 1,200 yards and 46-mile-per-hour gusts with iron sights was not a shooting problem anymore. It was a different kind of test entirely. She fired her 4th and 5th rounds at the 1,000-yard targets. Both hit. 5 for 5 at 1,000 yards. In a storm that had already eliminated one competitor and was actively degrading the performance of every electronic system on the range. At 1,047, the 1,200-yard line was announced. The range paused for a 10-minute equipment check and repositioning. During that pause, Grace stood up from her lane for the first time in nearly 2 hours. She rolled her shoulders. She shook out her hands. She drank half a bottle of water without tasting it, looking downrange at the 1,200-yard target, invisible at this moment behind a wall of horizontal precipitation, existing at that distance only as a point in space that she knew was there, because the range diagram said it was there. Chen appeared beside her. He looked like a man who had just spent 2 hours fighting the weather and had won most of the rounds, but not all of them. "I lost 2 at 1,000, he said. "The wind shifted on me twice." "I know, I heard it." "You're clean through the 1,000? "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same invisible distance she was looking at. 1,200, he said. "It wasn't a question. It was the way you say the name of something you're genuinely uncertain about." "I know." "Grace." He said her name the way he'd said it in the corridor 2 days ago, the way you say a name when you want the person to actually hear what comes next. Nobody has shot 1,200 yards clean in these conditions in the history of this competition. I looked it up last night. The record at 1,200 in adverse weather, the record is 3 for 5, and that was in a crosswind, half what we're dealing with today. She looked at him. "David?" "Yeah." "Thank you for looking that up." He almost laughed, almost. Then he shook his head and went back to his lane. She stood alone at the 1,200-yard mark for the remaining 4 minutes of the equipment pause. She did not think about records. She did not think about what was possible or impossible, according to the history of this competition or any other competition. She thought about a young man in a marine dress uniform standing straight in a photograph that was now pressed against her chest inside her jacket. And she thought about Hugh City in 1968. And she thought about rain and smoke and the sounds of combat on all sides. And she thought about iron sights and 12 confirmed kills and 37 Marines who came home because someone had done what nobody thought was possible in conditions that made impossible seem like an understatement. Her father had not had the luxury of a range diagram. He had not had a spotter call. He had not had a 10-minute equipment break or water or a dry jacket. He had had his rifle and his discipline and the place below thought. And he had done what needed to be done. Range is hot, Galloway said. 1,200 yards. Competitors fire at will. She settled into position. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, not to rest them, but to reset her entire nervous system to clear every previous shot in every previous moment of the last 2 days and arrive completely fresh at this single point in time. She opened her eyes. She found the approximate position of the target through the iron sights. At 1,200 yards in horizontal precipitation, she was not looking at a target. She was looking at a space in the world where she knew a target existed, and she was using every piece of data available to her. Wind flags, grass movement, air pressure on her skin, the sound of the gusts, the feel of the rifle in her hands, and the stock against her cheek to build a picture of what that space required. She built the picture. She pressed. The shot went down range, into the storm, into the distance, into the invisible. 2 seconds of silence. The spotter's voice came over the radio, and even through the weather and the static and the ambient noise of the range, it was absolutely clear. Hit Alpha range 1,200 yards. The range went quiet. Not the quiet of people being polite. The quiet of people who have just witnessed something they will talk about for the rest of their careers and will struggle to make anyone believe. Grace cycled the action. She found her position. She read the wind, the same patient, unhurried reading she had been doing for the last 2 hours. The wind was gusting hard from the left, cycling through peaks of what she estimated at 44, dropping back to 38 between gusts. She needed a window of relative stability. Not calm, there was no calm, just the trough between gusts where the force was consistent enough to calculate. She waited. 17 seconds. She pressed. Hit. She heard someone on the range say Jesus in a whisper that carried. She didn't know who. She was already building the picture for the third shot. At this point, something changed in the emotional texture of the range. The competitive atmosphere which had been present since the first morning, that particular tension of professionals measuring themselves against each other, had transformed into something else. It was not quite admiration, not yet. It was something more like the specific suspension of disbelief that occurs when you are watching something happen that your understanding of the world tells you should not be happening. And you have to choose between trusting your understanding and trusting your eyes. Most of the range had stopped shooting. Not officially, the range was still hot, but the tempo of fire from other lanes had slowed dramatically as competitors paused consciously or not to listen to what was happening in Grace Thornton's lane. She pressed her third round. Hit 3 for 3 at 1,200 yards in a 44-mile-per-hour crosswind with horizontal precipitation and iron sights on a Vietnam-era rifle. From somewhere down the range, she heard Mitchell's voice. He wasn't talking to anyone specific. He said it like a man saying something out loud because it needed to be said out loud to be believed. That's not possible. And then Patterson's voice, quiet and certain from 2 lanes over. It's happening, Mitchell. She had 2 rounds left. She had not missed a single shot all day. She built the picture for the 4th round, and she understood with the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to be honest with themselves about what they're actually experiencing, that she was now in a state of performance that she had never fully reached before. Not in training, not in competition, not in the 3 deployments where her shooting had saved lives. This was something she had only touched the edge of in her best moments. Her father had described it once in the quiet of an evening on the back porch in Virginia, looking at the tree line. He'd said that there were moments, rare moments, and you couldn't plan for them or force them when everything you had ever learned and practiced and been through stopped being separate things and became one thing. When the shooter and the rifle and the wind and the distance all became parts of a single conversation that was happening at a level below language. He'd said, those are the moments where you find out what you actually are. She pressed the 4th round. Hit. 1 round left. 1 more shot at 1,200 yards in the worst conditions the competition had ever seen. She breathed. She read. She waited. The wind peaked 46. She estimated the highest it had been all morning, and she physically felt it against her face and her hands and through the stock of the rifle. She waited for the peak to pass. It always passed. The peak always gave way to the trough because nothing stays at its peak. Not weather, not pain, not fear, not the worst thing that's ever tried to stop you. She felt the wind ease. She pressed. The range went completely silent as the round traveled 1,200 yards through rain and wind, and everything the morning had decided to throw at it. 2 seconds. The spotter's voice came through the radio like a verdict. Hit Alpha range, 1,200 yards, 5 for 5. And then for the first time in 3 days, the range did something that professional shooting ranges almost never do. It erupted. The sound that came off that range was not applause exactly. It was something rawer than applause, the involuntary release of people who had been holding their breath for 2 minutes and suddenly didn't have a reason to hold it anymore. Someone shouted. Someone else hit the wall of the scoring station with an open palm. Kowalski, 3 lanes down, said, "Come on," in the tone of a man who had just watched something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. Grace did not stand up immediately. She stayed in her prone position for a full 5 seconds after the spotter's call, with the rifle still in her shoulder, the iron sights still in front of her eye, looking downrange at the 1,200-yard distance that the storm had tried to make unreachable. She breathed once slowly. She let the moment be what it was without moving through it too fast. Because her father had told her once that the moments you earn deserve to be held before you let them go. Then she stood. She cleared the action, set the safety, and turned around. Every competitor on the range was looking at her. Not all of them with the same expression, some with genuine awe, some with something that was working through the complicated process of becoming awe from a starting point of disbelief, and at least one with an expression that was still trying to find a way not to be what it clearly was. Mitchell was standing at the edge of his lane, with his hands at his sides and his ballistic computer system still dark on the tripod behind him. And his face had the look of a man who has just had something fundamental about his understanding of the world corrected and who has not yet decided how he feels about that correction. Anderson was the first to move. He walked across the range without hurrying in the rain with his jacket open and his scoring tablet tucked under one arm, and he stopped in front of Grace and put his hand out. She shook it. "Your father," he said, "he'd have been something to see on a range." "He was," she said. Anderson held her hand for 1 extra second, then nodded once and stepped back. Chen was next, and he didn't say anything at all. He just looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared what he was going to say, and then discovered upon arrival that none of it was adequate. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, and she nodded at him, and that was enough. Patterson walked over last. He moved through the rain with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her for a long moment, the evaluating look that she had noticed from the very first day, the look that had been taking the measure of something specific since the beginning of the competition. "I owe you an explanation," he said. She waited. "I've been watching you since registration," he said. "Not because I doubted you, because I needed to see something confirmed." He paused. "I'm going to tell you something after the scoring session that you need to hear, not before the sequence matters, but I want you to know it's coming." She looked at him steadily. "What sequence? The official one?" He turned and walked back toward the staging area. She stood in the rain and watched him go, and the photograph inside her jacket pressed against her chest, and she thought he knows. At 12:15, the competitors gathered in the briefing room for the post-day 3 scoring session. The rain was audible against the roof, a constant, heavy percussion that underscored the weight of what was happening in the room. Galloway put the final scores on the board. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when numbers confirm what everyone already knew, but still needed to see written down. Grace Thornton, 20 for 20 across days 1 and 2, 20 for 20 on day 3. Perfect competition score. First place by a margin that was not close, not remotely close. Second place Patterson with 37 of 40, consistent and clean and exceptional. Third Anderson, 36 of 40, his only misses coming in the early morning hours of day 3 before he'd fully adapted to the wind pattern. Fourth Chen, 34 of 40, his 1,000-yard session having cost him what would have otherwise been a top 3 finish. Mitchell, 29 of 40, still qualifying, still technically in the top half of the field. But in a competition where the leader had shot 40 of 40 in conditions that had been designed by the weather itself. To make that impossible, 29 felt like a different number than it would have felt 3 days ago. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then someone at the back of the room, Grace didn't see, who began to clap. Slow, deliberate, the kind of applause that builds because the people joining it mean it. Within 4 seconds, it had spread to everyone in the room. Everyone except Mitchell. He was looking at the board. His jaw was working slightly, the micro movement of a man running an internal argument. Then he turned and looked at Grace across the room, and something moved through his expression, through the arrogance and the frustration and the competitive ego, something that looked like it was working very hard to become something else. He didn't clap, but he held her gaze. She held his. And then he looked away first, and she thought that in its own way, that was enough. Reeves entered the room at 12:30, and the applause stopped the way applause stops when a room understands that what's coming next is more important than celebrating what just happened. Scoring is final, he said. Competition standings are as posted. Allocation recommendations will be submitted to the 4 requesting units by end of business today. He looked at his tablet for a moment and then set it down. Before I close this session, I need to address an administrative matter that arose during the course of this competition. The room's atmosphere changed. Not visibly, no one moved, but Grace felt it shift, that particular change in air quality that happens when people who have been pretending not to know something are about to have the pretending taken away from them. An investigation was opened on day 1 following a formal report of equipment interference submitted by Captain Thornton. The investigation identified unauthorized access to the competitor staging area on the night of day 1. It identified the individual responsible at 05:47 this morning using entry log data that became available after the mandatory security delay expired. Reeves looked up from the tablet. He looked directly at Mitchell. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell, you are directed to report to the base JAG office at 1400 today. You are not to discuss this matter with any competitor before that time. Is that clear? The room had become so quiet that the rain on the roof sounded almost violent. Mitchell said, "Yes, Master Chief," in a voice that was controlled and professional and completely without affect. The voice of a man who had decided that whatever happened next, he was not going to let anyone see him break. "Dismissed," Reeves said. People began moving toward the door. Nobody said anything to Mitchell. Nobody said anything at all because the specific professional culture that those 14 people shared had an unspoken agreement about moments like this one. You let a person's dignity exist until the process said otherwise. But Grace, walking toward the door, felt a hand on her arm. Light, not grabbing. She turned. It was Mitchell. His face up close was different from what she expected. The arrogance she'd cataloged since registration, the performance of it, the studied confidence, had been replaced by something more complicated and harder to read. He looked like a man who had run a very long race on entirely the wrong fuel and had just now at the finish line realized what the fuel had cost him. "Thornton," he said. She waited. "I want to say," he stopped, started again. "What you did out there today. I need you to know that Another stop. He exhaled. "I don't have the words for it. I don't have a way to say it that doesn't sound like it's coming 24 hours too late." "It is 24 hours too late," she said. Not with anger, just with accuracy. He took that. "Yeah," he released her arm. "It is." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Were you the one who put the photograph on my case this morning?" Something changed in his expression. "What photograph?" She watched his face. He wasn't performing confusion. She had enough experience reading people under stress to know the difference between performed confusion and genuine surprise. "Someone left a photograph of my father on my equipment case this morning. Black and white, copy of an original." "Not me," he said. I didn't know about your father." She believed him. "Then what did you tamper with exactly?" His jaw tightened. "The ammunition, the lock. I didn't touch the sight. I want that on the record. I never touched the rifle itself." "Someone did," she said quietly. "Someone adjusted the rear sight 4 clicks right." She watched that land on him. The color in his face shifted. "That wasn't me," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. Whatever I did, and I'm not..." He stopped. "The sight wasn't me. Someone else went into that case." She looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "You'd better say all of that to the JAG officer." She turned and walked out. In the corridor, she stopped and stood with her back against the wall and let herself feel what she was feeling. The complicated mix of vindication and exhaustion, and the specific emotional aftermath of 3 days of sustained pressure, hostility, performance, and the underlying grief of missing her father with a sharpness that this competition had reopened in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The photograph was still inside her jacket. If Mitchell hadn't placed it, then someone else had. Someone who knew about her father. Someone who had gone to the trouble of finding an image of William Thornton in Marine dress uniform and printing it and leaving it as a message of support, she now believed. Not intimidation, support. And Patterson had said, "I'm going to tell you something after the scoring session that you need to hear." She pushed off the wall and went to find him. He was in the staging area packing his equipment with the same methodical care he brought to everything. He saw her coming and he didn't stop packing, but his attention shifted entirely to her even as his hands continued moving through the familiar process. "The photograph," she said, stopping in front of him. "My father." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. The same paper, the same printing, the same black and white image. He unfolded it and held it out to her. "You put it there," she said, "before 700 this morning. I wanted you to have it going into day 3. He paused. "I wanted you to know that someone on that range knew who he was." She took the second copy from him, looked at it, then looked at Patterson. "How do you know about my father?" Patterson closed his equipment case and turned to face her fully, the first time in 3 days that she'd seen him drop the evaluating posture entirely and just be a person standing in front of another person. He looked older this way and more honest and more tired. "Sergeant First Class William Thornton," he said, "Marine Corps, Vietnam 1968, Hugh City during Tet. 12 confirmed kills over 4 days of urban combat shooting from compromised positions under continuous fire in rain and smoke with degraded visibility and no spotter support after his original spotter was wounded on day 2. He paused. 37 Marines in his sector who came home because of his positioning and his shooting. A Silver Star that was submitted twice and lost in the administrative chaos of the post-Tet period. Another pause. He never received it. Grace was very still. "How do you know all of this?" she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady. "Because my father was in Hugh City," Patterson said. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He was one of the 37. The staging area, the wind, the rain, the sounds of the competition's aftermath all seemed to step back and leave them in a quiet that was nothing like the range quiet or the room quiet or any of the professional silences of the last 3 days. This was a different kind. "Your father," Grace said. She couldn't finish the sentence. "David Patterson Sr. He talked about the Marine sniper who held a rooftop on Nguyen Du Street for 4 days. Patterson's voice was controlled, but it had something underneath the control that was not going to be controlled indefinitely. He never knew the name. The units were mixed up. The records were a disaster. Tet was a disaster. But he talked about that sniper for the rest of his life. He said that man was the reason he came home. He said it at dinner tables and at reunions, and in a letter he wrote me the year before he died." He stopped. "I've been looking for that man's name for 12 years. Silence. "And then you walked into the registration area," Patterson said, "with an M14 in a case with electrical tape on the handle and your name on the sign-in sheet. And I looked up your service record, and I found your father's name. And I spent the rest of day 1 confirming what I was already certain of." Grace pressed her hand against her chest against the photograph inside her jacket. Her father, young and straight, and looking directly into the camera with the expression of someone who believed in what he was doing. "He never told me about the Silver Star," she said quietly. "He never mentioned it. He talked about the rifle. He talked about the craft. He never once talked about, he never said 37. "I believe it," Patterson said. "From what my father described, that man had no interest in what he was owed, only in what needed to be done." She looked at Patterson for a long moment, and the emotion that moved through her was not something she tried to control or contain or direct into the professional composure she'd maintained for 3 days. It was real and it was old, and it was the particular grief of someone who has just been told that the person they lost was even more than the person they knew. She said, "Your father came home because of mine." "Yes," Patterson said, "and I spent 3 days watching his daughter shoot in conditions that would have stopped anyone else on that range." He held her gaze. I think the apple didn't fall far. She laughed a short, real laugh that surprised her and that surprised him, and that broke the specific emotional tension of the last 4 minutes into something more manageable. She wiped her eye with the back of her hand unapologetically, and Patterson had the grace to look away while she did it and then look back when she was done. "The Silver Star," she said. "You said it was submitted twice and lost both times." The second submission was 1971. The officer who submitted it retired the following year, and the paperwork was never followed up. Patterson reached back into his jacket pocket and produced something else, a folded document thicker than the photograph. He held it out. "That's a copy of the original recommendation from 1968. I found it in the Marine Corps Historical Division archives 3 weeks ago. The original is being digitized." She took it. She unfolded it. Her father's name at the top, the unit designation, the dates November 1968. The specific bureaucratic language of a military commendation that could not quite contain what the writer was trying to say about a man who had held a rooftop for 4 days. Her hands were not entirely steady when she refolded it. "What do I do with this?" she asked, not rhetorically, genuinely. "There's a process for posthumous decoration review," Patterson said. "It's not fast and it's not guaranteed. But I've already made a preliminary inquiry through the Marine Corps Historical Office, and the documentation is sufficient to support a formal resubmission." He paused. "I'd like to help you with that process, if you'll allow it." She looked at him. Commander Daniel Patterson, 22 years in second place, in a competition where she just shot 40 of 40, the son of a man who had come home from Hugh City because of her father's rifle and her father's discipline, and her father's refusal to move from a position that needed to be held. "Why?" she said. Not why would he help, she understood why he would help. She meant something deeper. "Why did you watch for 3 days before saying anything? Why not tell me on day one?" "Because," he said, "if I told you on day one every shot you fired for the rest of this competition would have carried the weight of what I told you. And I didn't want that for you, Al." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to shoot clean. I wanted the performance to exist on its own terms, independent of what I was carrying about your father." He paused. "I wanted the world to see what you could do, not what you were doing for him." She absorbed that. "And the photograph this morning," she said. "Day 3 is a different thing. By this morning, I knew you'd already proven everything that needed proving. The photograph was for you, not for the range." He turned back to his equipment case. "It was so you'd know you weren't alone out there." She stood in the staging area for a long time after Patterson walked out, holding the copy of the 1968 commendation in one hand and the photograph of her father in the other, listening to the rain ease slightly, the storm beginning finally to give some of its intensity back to the atmosphere from which it had come. At 1400 hours, while Mitchell was in the JAG office, the allocation recommendations went out to 4 special operations units. Grace's name was at the top of every list, flagged with a notation she'd never seen before in competition documentation. "Exceptional performance under extreme adverse conditions. Recommend priority consideration." At 14:30, Reeves found her in the staging area and sat down beside her without ceremony. "The investigation has a second component," he said. "You told me last night that someone adjusted the rear sight and it wasn't the same person who took the ammunition." I said Mitchell denied it. Mitchell's attorney confirmed his account this morning. The activity log shows his key was used only twice during the competition. Both times were accounted for in what he admitted to. Reeves looked at her. Someone else entered the staging area. Someone with a different key. She went still. "We have a second entry on the log," he said. "Different access credential. We're running the identification now." He paused. "I want you to know that this investigation is not closing with Mitchell. There is a second person involved, and I intend to find out who authorized a key to that staging area to someone outside the competitor pool." She thought about that. A second person, someone with institutional access, not a competitor, but someone embedded in the structure of the competition itself. Someone who had wanted her eliminated badly enough to risk their career and their clearance over it. "Master Chief," she said, "why would someone inside the administrative structure care enough about me specifically to tamper with my equipment?" Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that she did not expect. "Your father's resubmission." The preliminary inquiry Patterson made to the Marine Corps Historical Office 3 weeks ago, it didn't only go to the Historical Office. Those inquiries get logged. The log is accessible to certain personnel. He paused. There are people, Captain, fewer than you'd think, but more than there should be, who have a professional interest in keeping certain Vietnam-era records exactly as complicated as they currently are. She understood what he was saying. She understood the implication of it, and the cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Someone tried to discredit me, she said slowly, before I could be associated with my father's record, before a decorated performance could add weight to a posthumous decoration review. That's my working theory, Reeves said. I want to be clear, it's not confirmed, but the timing is not coincidental, and I have been doing this long enough to know the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. She sat with that for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of the specific cold anger that comes not from being attacked, but from understanding the full scope of why you were attacked, the comprehensive, institutional, premeditated nature of it. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" A formal statement, documented timeline, everything in your log, plus anything you remember that wasn't in the log. He stood, and your permission to coordinate with Commander Patterson because he has documentation that may be directly relevant to establishing motive. You have it, she said. Reeves nodded once and started to go. Master Chief, he stopped. The security assignment you put on my staging area after day 1, she said. Was that standard protocol? He looked at her with those iron gray eyes. No, he said. That was me deciding that something worth protecting was being threatened by people who didn't understand its value. He paused. Your father's daughter, with his rifle, in a competition like this. He held her gaze one more second. Some things you protect because the regulation says to. Some things you protect because they matter. He walked out. Grace sat alone in the staging area with her father's photograph and his 1968 commendation, and the weight of 3 days that had been so much more than a competition, and she felt underneath the exhaustion and the anger and the complicated grief, something she recognized from the very best moments of her shooting, the clarity that comes when everything that isn't essential falls away, and what remains is exactly what it needs to be. She opened the rifle case. She looked at the M14 worn and repaired and carried across decades from a man who had used it to hold a rooftop in Hughes City for 4 days so that 37 Marines could come home. She thought about what Reeves had just told her, about patterns and timing and institutional resistance to truths that complicated comfortable histories, about the people who had tried to move her off this range before she could prove what she'd proven. They hadn't moved her. And now they were going to have to explain themselves. She closed the case, latched it, and stood up. The formal statement took 2 hours. Grace sat across from a JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Briggs, who had the specific practiced neutrality of someone whose job required them to receive difficult information without reacting to it visibly. She walked him through every entry in her log, the ammunition count, the case lock, the sight adjustment, and she did it in the precise, sequential language of someone who understood that the accuracy of what she said now was as important as the accuracy of what she'd done on the range. Briggs recorded everything. He asked clarifying questions that told her he was not approaching this casually. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her. Captain Thornton, I want to be direct with you. The second access credential we identified belongs to a civilian contractor attached to the competition's administrative support team. His name is Warren Elias. He has held a support role with Naval Special Warfare Command for 11 years. She kept her expression level. What's his security clearance level? Secret, sufficient for access to competitor staging areas under competition protocol. Briggs paused. He was placed in that role 3 weeks ago, transferred from a desk position in the Marine Corps Historical Liaison Office. The room went very quiet. The Marine Corps Historical Liaison Office, she repeated. Yes. She thought about what Reeves had told her about inquiry logs, about the preliminary resubmission inquiry that Patterson had made 3 weeks ago about institutional resistance to complicated histories. And now a man who had worked in the Historical Liaison Office had been transferred to competition administrative support at exactly the same time Patterson's inquiry had been logged. That's not a coincidence, she said. No, Briggs said. It's so. It is not. She leaned forward. Who authorized the transfer? Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at the part of an investigation that is significantly above the pay grade of the current conversation. That question is now being handled by a separate office. What I can tell you is that the answer to it does not stay within this command. She understood what that meant. This was not going to be resolved in a JAG office on a Navy base in California. This was going to go somewhere larger and older and considerably more resistant to resolution. She had known that since Reeves had first said the word pattern. What happens to Elias, she said. He's been suspended pending investigation. His access has been revoked. Briggs paused. He has not been cooperative. Of course not, she said. She signed her statement at 1618 and walked out into a corridor that still smelled like the competition gun oil and coffee and the particular institutional humidity of a place where serious people had been doing serious things under serious pressure. The rain had stopped. She could hear it in the changed quality of the air. At 1645, she found Chen in the common area sitting alone with a coffee going cold on the table in front of him. He looked up when she sat down across from him, and his expression told her that the range of things he wanted to say had narrowed to the point where saying any of them felt insufficient. You gave a statement, he said. It wasn't a question. 2 hours. Elias. She looked at him. How do you know that name? Kowalski. He's been talking to people. Chen wrapped both hands around his cold coffee without drinking it. Grace, do you understand how far up this goes? I'm starting to understand it. Because Elias didn't get that transfer on his own. Someone moved him. Someone with enough authority to reassign a liaison officer into a competition support role without triggering a standard review, and that kind of authority doesn't live at the commander level. That lives. David, she said. He stopped. I know where it lives, she said quietly. And I know that knowing where it lives doesn't mean I can touch it. Not today. Not by myself. Patterson can touch it, Chen said. Patterson has documentation going back to 1968, and he has his father's testimony, and he has contacts in the Marine Corps Historical Division, and he paused and looked at her steadily. He has the competition scorecard of a woman who just shot 40 out of 40 in a 46-mile-per-hour storm with iron sights and a Vietnam-era rifle. That scorecard exists now. It cannot be unmade. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this since the scoring session. I've been thinking about this since day one, he said. When they took your ammunition and you didn't tell anyone for 8 hours. He set the coffee down. I knew then. I knew what kind of person I was watching. I just didn't know the full story yet. She didn't say anything. The quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together that neither of them will fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. Then Chen said, What are you going to do? She thought about her father, about a rooftop in Hugh City, about 4 days of holding a position that needed to be held when everything around it was falling apart, about the fact that he had never once, not once in all the years she'd known him, complained about the Silver Star that was submitted twice and lost twice and never followed up. He had never once said he was owed anything. He had only said what the job required, and then he had done it. The same thing I've been doing, she said. She meant hold the position. Chen nodded. He understood completely. At 1800, Patterson called a meeting. He did it quietly, a word to Grace, to Reeves, to Anderson, and to Briggs, and they gathered in the small conference room at the end of the administrative block. No agenda, no formal structure, just 5 people who had arrived at the same intersection from different directions. Patterson stood at the front of the room with the narrow spiral notebook in one hand and a folder in the other. He looked like a man who had been preparing for this specific conversation for 12 years. I want to lay out what we have, he said, and I want to be clear about what it can do and what it can't. He opened the folder. William Thornton's original Silver Star recommendation, 1968, corroborating witness statements from the 3 surviving members of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines collected over the last 18 months, including a recorded statement from my father made 14 months before his death. The preliminary inquiry filed with the Marine Corps Historical Division 3 weeks ago, and the competition record from this week, which establishes beyond any reasonable challenge that the training and methodology William Thornton passed to his daughter produced one of the most exceptional precision shooting performances in the history of this competition, under conditions that no previous competitor has faced with equivalent results. He set the folder on the table. What this can do support a formal posthumous decoration review. The documentation meets the standard for resubmission, and the witness statements are compelling. The historical division contact I spoke with last week told me privately that this is the strongest posthumous case she's seen in her tenure. A pause. What it can't do, move fast. The review process for posthumous decorations is measured in years, not months. It involves multiple levels of command review, historical verification, and ultimately a recommendation that has to survive contact with the same institutional environment that buried it twice before. Anderson said, the same environment that transferred Elias. Yes, Patterson said, which is why the investigation Briggs is conducting matters independently of the decoration review. If there's a documented pattern of institutional interference with this record, and I believe there is, then that pattern becomes part of the context in which the resubmission is evaluated. Reeves, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away, said, the Elias transfer authorization is being traced. I expect a name within 72 hours. Whose name? Grace said. A flag officer, Reeves said. That's as specific as I'll be until it's confirmed. The room held that for a moment. A flag officer, admiral or general level, someone with enough institutional authority and enough institutional interest in keeping certain records complicated that they had moved a person into position to sabotage a competition rather than risk what a decorated performance might mean for a posthumous decoration review. Grace thought they were afraid of me before I fired a shot. And then she thought because they knew what the rifle meant. They knew whose it was. They knew what a perfect score in this competition, carried by the daughter of William Thornton, would do to the argument for keeping his record exactly as buried as it had been for 56 years. They had tried to stop her because they understood the stakes better than she had when she walked in on day one. That realization was cold and clarifying and made her angrier than anything else that had happened in 3 days. I want to be part of this process, she said. Not asking, stating. You are the center of this process, Patterson said. Nothing moves without you. Briggs said, Captain Thornton, I need to advise you formally as the primary complainant in the equipment interference investigation and the family member in the decoration review your position here is significant. There will be pressure, institutional pressure, not necessarily overt, but real. People will be professional about it, and the professionalism will be the pressure. I know what institutional pressure feels like, she said. I know you do, Briggs said. I'm telling you it's going to be continuous, not for weeks, possibly for years. She looked at him steadily. Lieutenant Commander, I just spent 3 days on a range where someone removed my ammunition, entered my equipment case, twice adjusted my rifle sight, and then challenged the integrity of the scoring system when none of that worked. I shot 40 out of 40 anyway. She paused. Institutional pressure is going to have to bring something different. Anderson made a sound that was almost a laugh. Reeves looked at the table in a way that suggested he was also controlling a laugh. Patterson said, then we file the resubmission. We do it properly with full documentation, and we attach the competition record, and we let the weight of what's true do what truth does when it's given enough room to move. When, Grace said. I'd like to file within 30 days. That gives time for the Elias investigation to develop and for Briggs to document the interference pattern formally. He looked at her. Does that work for you? Yes, she said. The meeting ended at 19:10. People filtered out until it was just Grace and Patterson in the room. He was putting the folder back together, the same careful, methodical movements she'd watched him apply to everything for 3 days. He didn't speak until the folder was closed and set aside. Your father never knew my father survived, he said. Not a question. No, he didn't talk about specific people. He talked about the job. She paused. I think knowing would have mattered to him. It would have mattered to my father too. That the man who held that rooftop knew he came home. Patterson picked up his notebook. I'm going to make sure that when the review is complete, whenever that is, the record says clearly what your father did and who came home because of it. All 37 names if I can find them. Because that's what the record should have said in 1968 and didn't, and that's what it's going to say now. She thought about her father on the back porch in Virginia, looking at the tree line in the evening, not talking about Hugh City, not talking about what he was owed just being present in the life he'd come home to with the particular quiet of a man who had put something in the place below, thought, and left it there. She thought about what he would say right now if he could. She thought he'd probably say took long enough. And she thought he might also say good. She picked up the rifle case. She shook Patterson's hand, and this time it was not the handshake of competitors, but something different. The handshake of people connected by something older than either of them. The specific gravity of a debt between families that had existed for 56 years without anyone on either side knowing the other's name. Thank you, she said, for keeping looking for 12 years. Thank your father, Patterson said. He gave my father 30 more years. My father gave me. It was always going to come back around. She walked out into the evening. The base was quieter now. The competition's energy had settled into something less acute, the way all intensities settle eventually into the ordinary texture of time passing. She walked across the open ground toward the competitor barracks without hurrying, the rifle case on her shoulder, the original photograph in her jacket against her chest, the copy of the 1968 commendation folded in her breast pocket. At 2015, she sat on the edge of her bunk and opened the rifle case one more time. She took out the photograph from the caselet, her father young and straight and looking directly into the camera, and she held it alongside the copy of the commendation, and she looked at both of them together for the first time. William Thornton, Sergeant First Class, Marine Corps, Vietnam 1968, Hughes City, 4 days, 12 confirmed kills, 37 Marines home. A Silver Star submitted twice lost, twice, never followed up, never awarded, never acknowledged by the institution he'd served, without complaint for the entirety of his career. And a daughter who had carried his rifle into a competition where someone powerful enough to move pieces on an institutional board had decided she needed to be stopped before she could make his record impossible to ignore. They hadn't stopped her. The scorecard existed, 40 of 40, in conditions that had broken every electronic system on the range, with iron sights, with his rifle, with the discipline and the patience and the method that he had pressed into her hands, one lesson at a time, starting when she was 12 years old, on a range behind a house in rural Virginia, teaching her to breathe and to wait and to feel the wind and to trust what the body knows when the mind gets out of its way. She thought about what Patterson had said, I wanted the world to see what you could do, not what you were doing for him, but the truth she could acknowledge now sitting alone in the quiet of the barracks, with the competition behind her, and the review process ahead of her, and everything in between still being what it was that those two things had never been separate. What she could do and what she was doing for him had always been the same thing, because he had made her what she was, and what she was had produced what the scorecard said. And what the scorecard said could not be taken back by anyone who wanted to pretend that performance like that was ordinary or expected or anything other than the specific result of a specific man's teaching passing through decades and deployments and grief and pressure into the hands of his dog at the exact moment it needed to be there. She had not competed for him, but she had competed because of him and with him in the only sense that mattered, in the craft he'd passed to her, in the method he'd made her own in the place below, thought he'd taught her to find and to trust when everything above thought was trying to convince her to do something easier. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize with a Virginia area code. It said, Captain Thornton, I served with your father in Hughes City. My name is James Caldwell. I heard from Daniel Patterson that you're working on his record. I have a letter your father wrote the night before he rotated out. He left it with the chaplain. I've had it for 55 years. I didn't know who to send it to until now. Please call me when you can. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the bunk beside her and put her hand over her mouth and sat very still for a moment, the way you sit when something so unexpected and so exactly right arrives that your body needs a second to understand what to do with it. A letter, her father's handwriting, from the night before he rotated out of Hughes City. She had never, not in 26 years since his death, not in all the boxes of his belongings she'd gone through, not in any corner of the house in Virginia, found anything he'd written from Vietnam. She had assumed he hadn't written. He was not a man who had expressed himself easily on paper. He had expressed himself in patience and in craft and in the specific daily unglamorous discipline of teaching her to do one thing perfectly rather than many things adequately. But he had written. On the night before he left Hughes City, he had written, and he had left it with the chaplain, and a man named James Caldwell had carried it for 55 years waiting for someone to send it to. She picked up the phone. She called the number. It rang twice. An old man's voice answered clear and steady, and with the specific quality of men who have lived past the age where they feel the need to perform composure because real composure doesn't need to perform. "Captain Thornton," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "tell me about my father." And James Caldwell, who had been 22 years old in Hughes City in 1968, who had watched William Thornton hold a rooftop for 4 days without sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch, who had seen what a man with a rifle and an absolute refusal to move could do for the people depending on him, began to talk. She listened for an hour and 12 minutes. She did not take notes. She didn't need to. Every word of it went into the place that her father had taught her to keep for the things that mattered most, the place below. Thought, below noise, below the reach of anything that wanted to diminish or complicate or bury what was true. When Caldwell finished, there was a long silence between them. The silence of two people who have arrived at the end of something they have been carrying separately for a very long time. "He was the finest man I ever watched work," Caldwell said. "Not because of the shooting, because of the stillness, because nothing could move him when he decided a thing needed to be done." "No," Grace said softly. "Nothing could." She thanked him. She told him she would call again. She told him the letter when it arrived was going into the resubmission file where it belonged. He said good, and that he was glad, and that he had wondered for 55 years if the right person would ever come along to pick up what William Thornton had left behind. She said she did. She hung up. She sat with the rifle case open in front of her and the photograph in her hand, and the evening settling around her, and she felt more clearly than she had felt anything in 3 days of competition, in sabotage and revelation, that she understood now what the competition had actually been. Not a test of her shooting. That had never been in doubt, not to her. It had been a test of the thing her father had built in her, the thing that no tampered ammunition or adjusted sight or institutional machinery could reach, because it didn't live in the equipment. It lived in the place below thought where he'd put it 26 years ago, on a range in rural Virginia, one lesson at a time. They had tried to move her. She had not moved. The silver star that William Thornton was never given in 1968 was not going to stay buried. The 37 names were not going to stay anonymous. The 4 days on a rooftop in Hughes City were not going to stay in the administrative chaos of a post-tet filing system, lost between one bureaucratic desk and the next, waiting for someone to decide they didn't matter enough to follow up. Because his daughter had walked into a competition with his rifle, and she had shot 40 out of 40 in a storm that broke every other system on the range, and the scorecard existed, and the investigation existed, and Patterson's documentation existed, and Caldwell's 55-year-old letter existed, and none of it was going away. She closed the rifle case. She set it beside her bunk. She turned off the light. In the dark, she said the thing she said to him every night since she was 24 years old, quietly in the way of a private language between two people, one of whom was no longer present in any form, except the most permanent one. "Got it done, Dad." And for the first time in 3 days, for the first time in longer than 3 days, if she was honest, she slept like someone who had held a position and held it clean and was not going to let go. Some legacies are buried by the people who fear them, but the ones worth keeping always find their way back to the surface, carried by a daughter, a rifle, and the unbreakable discipline of a man who taught her that when everything fails, the only thing that matters is whether you moved. William Thornton did not move. Neither did she. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came in a padded envelope that had been addressed by hand in the careful block capitals of a man who had been taught penmanship in a schoolhouse 70 years ago and had never seen a reason to abandon it. The return address was a town in the Shenandoah Valley that Grace had driven through once or twice without ever stopping. James Caldwell had not trusted it to anything that could be misrouted or rerouted or lost the way her father's record had been lost twice already. He had driven 40 minutes to a post office paid for tracking and called her the moment it left his hands. She had been carrying her own grief carefully for 26 years, the way you carry something you've learned to balance, and she thought she knew the full weight of it. She did not. She found that out when she slid her thumb under the flap of that envelope and a single sheet of paper came out. Not the original. Caldwell had kept the original. This was a photocopy he'd made at a library the day after they spoke, and she saw her father's handwriting for the first time in a sentence longer than a grocery list. If you're reading this, it began then. Either I made it home and forgot I ever wrote it or I didn't, and somebody kind enough to carry it has finally found the right hands. She had to stop there. She set the page down on the kitchen table in the house in rural Virginia. The same house, the same kitchen. And she put both hands flat on the wood on either side of it and breathed the way he had taught her to breathe in and out and halfway out until the thing in her chest settled enough to let her keep reading. I don't have much to say that the Marines around me wouldn't say better. We held a roof on a street I can't pronounce. Some of us are going home who weren't supposed to. That's the whole of it. I'm not owed anything for it, and I don't want anybody making it into more than it was, because making it into more is how you forget what it actually cost the ones who paid. But I learned a thing up here I'd like to pass on in case I don't get the chance to pass it on slow the way good things ought to be passed. Steady isn't something you reach for when the moment comes. By then it's too late to go looking. Steady is a decision you make a long time before in the quiet when nothing is asking anything of you, and then you just keep the decision. You keep it on the ordinary days when it doesn't matter. You keep it when you're cold and tired and nobody's watching. And then the moment shows up, and the moment doesn't make you into anything. The moment only finds out what you already chose. Whoever you are holding this, keep your decision. UT. She read it 4 times. Then she read it a 5th time slowly, and she understood something that rearranged a piece of her own life. He had said those words to her. Not these exact words. He was not a man who repeated himself, and he would have considered it a kind of cheating to teach his daughter out of a letter he'd written before she was born. But the idea of them, the bone of them, he had pressed into her so many times on the range behind this house that she had stopped hearing it as instruction and started hearing it as simply the shape of the world. Steady is a choice you make before you need it. She had been 16, 18, 22, lying prone in the grass with his old M14 against her cheek, and he had said it in a dozen different ways, and she had thought it was something he believed. It wasn't something he believed. It was something he had learned on a rooftop on Nguyen Du Street in the rain, with men dying around him, and 37 who wouldn't die because he refused to move. He had carried it down off that roof and across the Pacific and through 30 more years of an ordinary life. And then he had spent it patiently, one lesson at a time, on a girl with cold hands who couldn't yet hold 3 shots in a row. She had been firing his rooftop her whole life and never known it. She folded the letter along its old creases and put it in the breast pocket of her jacket next to the photograph where it would stay until she had a frame worthy of it. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She walked out the back door across the yard, wet with morning, to the range her father had built with his own hands 4 decades ago, and she stood at the firing line with no rifle and no target and nothing to prove. And she let herself cry the way she had not let herself cry at his funeral, because at his funeral she had been 24 and determined to be steady, and steady had been the only gift she knew how to give him. He would not have minded the crying. She understood that now too. Put the noise where it belongs, he'd told her. Somewhere you can find it later if you need it, but somewhere it can't find you first. He had never said the noise wasn't real. He had only taught her when to let it find her. And the competition was behind her, and the war was behind her, and there was nobody on that range now whose life depended on her composure. So she let it find her. And then when it was done, she wiped her face and went back inside and started making phone calls, because the letter was evidence now, and evidence belonged in a file. The flag officer's name came on a Tuesday, 72 hours, almost to the minute after Reeves had promised it. Grace was not in the room when it was confirmed. She heard it from Patterson, who called her in the evening with the particular flatness in his voice that he used when he was working hard to keep something out of it. The name was Rear Admiral Howard Vance. 3 stars short of the top, but powerful in the way that mattered for a thing like this chairman for the last 6 years of an institutional history board, whose official account of the urban battles of early 1968 had been written, refined, and defended under his signature. An account in which the rooftop on Nguyen Du Street was held by elements of the battalion, and the 37 Marines came home through coordinated defensive action, and there was no sniper, no Sergeant First Class William Thornton, no 4 days, no 12, no man at all. A man cannot be denied a medal that the official history says does not exist. Vance had not pulled the trigger on any of it himself. That was not how men at his altitude operated. He had simply noticed when Patterson's inquiry hit the historical division logs 3 weeks before the competition that a question was being asked that his entire signed account could not survive being answered. And he had reached down through two intermediaries in a transfer order and arranged for Warren Elias, a man with a grievance and a security clearance, and access to a staging area to be in a position to make a Marine captain look unreliable before she could become the living, breathing 40 out of 40 argument for her father's existence. It had not worked. Grace took a private and uncharitable satisfaction in exactly how much it had not worked. They had set out to discredit her, and instead they had handed Briggs a documented pattern of institutional interference stretching from a 1970 when lost submission to a 2020's tampered rifle sight, and all of it orbiting the same buried record, and a pattern once documented becomes its own kind of evidence. They had tried to bury her father one more time, and in the trying they had finally fatally confirmed that there was something there to bury. "What happens to him?" Grace asked. "Referral," Patterson said. "It's above all of us now. It's at the level where the decisions are quiet and the language is careful. But I'll tell you what I know. Vance put in his retirement paperwork this morning." A pause. 41 years of service. He's leaving before they can make him leave, which is what men like Vance always do, because the one thing they understand perfectly is the value of controlling the story. Another pause, and now the thing he'd been keeping out of his voice came partway in. "The history board is being reconstituted. The account is being reopened. Grace, they're reopening the account, the one that erased him. They have to now." She was quiet for a moment. "Elias," she said, "cooperating finally. His lawyer found him religion once he understood Vance had cut him loose. He's named the chain. He'll keep his pension if he tells all of it, and he wants to keep his pension, so he's telling all of it." Patterson exhaled. "It's not clean. None of it's clean. A man like Vance doesn't get marched out in handcuffs for what he did to a piece of paper 50 years ago. But he doesn't get to keep the paper either. That's the trade. We don't get the satisfaction of watching him pay. We get the only thing that was ever actually worth having." "The record," Grace said. "The record," Patterson agreed. "The true one." It is worth saying here because this is the part of these stories that nobody tells you about, the part that doesn't fit in 3 days on a range or a single dramatic scene, that the resubmission of a posthumous decoration is not a moment. It is a season. It is several seasons. It is a folder that travels from one desk to another at the speed of bureaucracy, which is the slowest speed. There is slower than weather, slower than grief. Patterson filed it within his 30 days exactly as he'd said. The folder by then was no longer thin. The 1968 original recommendation. The 1971 resubmission recovered from an archive box that had not been opened since the Ford administration. Corroborating statements from the 3 surviving members of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, whom Patterson had spent 18 months finding, one of them in a nursing home in Arizona, one of them on a fishing boat in Alaska, one of them in a townhouse 9 miles from the historical division that had spent decades pretending his story wasn't real. The recorded statement of David Patterson Sr., made 14 months before his death, in which an old man with a failing voice described in detail he had carried for 50 years, the Marine who held the roof and the night the roof should have fallen and didn't. Caldwell's letter, the letter now authenticated, the handwriting verified against William Thornton's service records, entered as the contemporaneous testimony of the man who wrote it, dated the night before he rotated out of Hughes City, and the competition record, 40 of 40. Conditions documented. The notation no one had ever seen before: exceptional performance under extreme adverse conditions. And around all of it, like a frame that made the picture impossible to look away from, the Briggs report, the documented pattern of interference, the Elias transfer, the Vance referral, the institutional fingerprints on 56 years of an absence that had finally been forced to explain itself. It went up the chain in the spring. It survived the first review in the summer. Grace learned to live inside the not knowing, which was its own discipline, not unlike the discipline of waiting for a wind to cycle through to the moment you could trust. She did her work. She visited Virginia. She sat on the back porch in the evenings and looked at the tree line the way her father used to, and she found that she could feel him there in a way she hadn't been able to since she was 24, not as an absence anymore, but as a presence she'd finally understood the size of. Caldwell came to visit her in the early fall, driving down from the valley in a truck older than some of the Marines Grace had served with. He was 80 years old and walked with a cane and had the clear, steady, unperforming voice of a man long past the need to seem like anything other than what he was. He stood on the range behind the house, the range her father had built, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He'd come home and build a range, Caldwell finally said. Of course he would. He turned to her. You know what he was like up there? People always want the war stories. They want the loud part. But the thing about your father, the thing I never forgot, was how quiet he was. Everything around us was the loudest thing you ever heard in your life, and he was the one still pointing it. He'd say maybe 10 words a day. He'd just be there, be steady. And the rest of us, we'd look over at him, not moving, not flinching, just doing the job one shot at a time, and somehow that made it possible for us to do ours. He shook his head slowly. You can't train that into men. You can only stand next to it and let it train you. He trained it into me, Grace said, one shot at a time. I know he did, Caldwell said. I watched you do it on the news, Captain. The whole country watched you do it. He smiled an old man's smile full of a thing too large for the face holding it. I told my wife, God rest her, she'd have loved this. I said, that's him. That's the rooftop. He found a way to put himself on a range 50 years later and hold a position one more time. He looked at Grace and his eyes were wet, and he did not apologize for it any more than she had on this range a few months before. He just used you to do it. She did not correct him because he wasn't wrong and because there was nothing in the world she would rather be than the instrument her father had reached for across 56 years to finish what they tried to bury. The word came in November. It came the way the most important things often come, without drama, in an ordinary envelope on an ordinary afternoon. Patterson called first because he'd had a contact watch for it, and his voice when she picked up was not flat anymore. It was the voice of a man who has spent 12 years looking for a name and has finally found it written where it always should have been. It's approved, he said. She didn't say anything. Grace, it's approved. The Silver Star, posthumous. Sergeant First Class William Thornton, United States Marine Corps, for conspicuous gallantry at Hue City, Republic of Vietnam, February 1968. His voice caught and he let it catch and he kept going. 58 years. It took 58 years, and your scorecard, and my father's voice from beyond the grave, and a letter an old man carried for half a century, but it's done. It's signed. They're going to read his name out loud at a ceremony with full honors, and the record, the official record, the one Vance signed, the one that said he didn't exist, the official record now says what he did and who came home because of it. She stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the photograph in her breast pocket and the letter beside it, and she found that she could not speak, and that for once in her life she did not need to be steady about it. Grace, Patterson said, you still there? I'm here, she managed. All 37 names, he said quietly. I found them, every one. They're in the citation. It's the first time in 58 years that those 37 men are written down in the same document as the man who saved them. A pause. That's what your father did. He didn't just hold a roof. He made it so 37 other men got to have whole lives and grandchildren and ordinary Tuesdays. And now there's a piece of paper signed at the highest level that says so forever. Another pause. He'd have hated the fuss. He'd have hated the fuss, Grace agreed and laughed, and it came out broken, and that was all right. And he'd have stood at attention through every second of it and never let anyone see. Then let's give him a ceremony he'd have hated, Patterson said, and let's do it right. They did it at the Marine Barracks in Washington in the spring on a parade ground that had seen 2 centuries of men marched across it for reasons good and bad. Grace had argued gently for somewhere smaller. Her father would have wanted somewhere smaller, but Patterson had said something that ended the argument. The smallness was the injustice. 58 years of smallness. We are not going to write it quietly. And she had understood that he was right, and that there was a difference between the man's humility and the institution's debt, and that the debt had earned the parade ground. She wore her dress blues. She had not worn them in 2 years, and they fit the way they had always fit, which is to say they fit like a decision made long before kept. She stood at the front of a formation under a clean sky, and she was aware of every person behind her and around her, and she let the awareness be there, without letting it touch the still place where she kept the things that mattered. They had all come. Caldwell sat in the front row of the seated guests in a suit that was 40 years old, and pressed like a flag, his cane across his knees, his chin up. Beside him sat the 2 other survivors of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, who had been well enough to travel, one in a wheelchair. one on the arm of a granddaughter, three old men who had been 20 years old on a rooftop and were the last living proof of what that rooftop had cost and what it had bought. Behind them, filling rows, sat the families of the rest of the 37 sons and daughters and grandchildren of men who had come home because of William Thornton and had lived whole lives and died ordinary deaths and never known the name of the Marine who had made it possible. They knew it now. Patterson had found them, every family, and written to everyone and told them, "Your father came home because of a man named William Thornton. Here is what he did. Here is where you can come to hear it said out loud." Lieutenant David Chen stood in the formation, 2 men down from Grace, a Marine among Marines, exactly where he had been on the range, and exactly where he had said he'd be present, watching quietly certain. Captain Bradley Anderson had driven up from Fort Benning in his own dress uniform, because some things you show up for. Master Chief Jack Reeves stood at the back in the still iron gray silence he wore like a second uniform. The man who had decided on day one that something worth protecting was being threatened by people who didn't understand its value. And near the end of a row in dress white sat Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell. He had written to her 6 weeks before a letter that had clearly cost him more than any shot he'd ever fired. He had accepted his administrative consequences without contesting them. He had given a full and unflattering account of what he'd done to the JAG, to the board, to himself. And in the letter to Grace, he had not asked for forgiveness, which she respected, because asking would have been one more performance, and he was done performing. He had only asked if he could come and stand for her father. "I disrespected a rifle I didn't understand," he wrote, "carried by a Marine I didn't understand, belonging to a man I am ashamed I laughed at without knowing. I would like to be in the formation that honors him. I will understand if the answer is no." The answer had been yes. Her father, she was certain, would have wanted it to be yes. A man does the job in front of him, and Mitchell's job now was to stand up straight and learn the lesson all the way down, and she was not going to deny him the chance to do it on the only ground where it counted. The citation was read by a general whose name Grace would not remember afterward because she was not listening to the man. She was listening to the words. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy." The parade ground was silent. Sergeant First Class William Thornton, occupying an exposed rooftop position on Nguyen Du Street, Hugh City, did over a period of 4 days and through continuous enemy fire in conditions of rain, smoke, and severely degraded visibility, and without spotter support, following the wounding of his assigned spotter, maintain his position and deliver precision fire that broke repeated enemy advances against his sector. She breathed, in out, halfway out, disregarding his own safety and refusing relief or relocation. When both were offered, Sergeant Thornton's actions directly resulted in the survival of 37 Marines of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines who would otherwise have been overrun. And then the general did the thing that Patterson had fought for, the thing that had taken 58 years to make possible. He read the names, all 37 of them, one at a time, slows each name allowed to land and be heard and be true, while in the seated rows the sons and daughters and grandchildren of those 37 men sat with their hands over their mouths, or their eyes closed, or their faces lifted to the sky, hearing their own existence read aloud as the consequence of one man's refusal to move. When the last name was read, the silence on the parade ground was not the silence of protocol. It was the silence of the range on day 3, the moment after the spotter's voice came through the storm, the silence of people who have witnessed something their understanding of the world had told them shouldn't be possible, and have had to choose between their understanding and their eyes, and have chosen their eyes. Grace stepped forward to receive the medal on her father's behalf. It was a small thing, a silver star, a piece of metal and ribbon that weighed almost nothing in the hand. She had held heavier things. She had held his rifle through 40 rounds in a 46-mile-an-hour storm. But she had never in her life held anything that contained as much. And when the general placed it in her white-gloved palm and closed her fingers around it and held her hand for 1 extra second, long enough to say very quietly, words not in any program, the Corps was wrong. "Captain, and it's sorry and thank you," she understood that this was the moment the letter had described. The moment that doesn't make you into anything. The moment that only finds out what you already chose. She had chosen a long time before on a range behind a house in Virginia, with cold hands and a man's patient voice in her ear. She had chosen to be steady. And she had kept the decision through deployments and grief and 3 days of sabotage and 58 years of an injustice that had done everything in its considerable institutional power to make her stop. She had not stopped. She turned to face the formation and the families and the 3 old men in the front row, and she held the medal up just slightly, just enough for them to see it catch the spring light. And she did not say a word, because there were no words that would not have been smaller than the silence. The 3 survivors of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines rose. It cost them something to rise. One needed his granddaughter's arm, and one needed both hands on his cane. And the rising was slow and was difficult and was the most eloquent thing on that parade ground. They rose and they came to attention, 3 old Marines in old suits, and they held a salute toward a medal that belonged to a man who had been dead for 26 years and gone from that rooftop for 58, and who had given them, between the 3 of them and the 34 others, something close to 2,000 years of life that they would not otherwise have had. Grace returned the salute. She held it. She did not let her hand shake, and her hand did not shake because her father had taught her that the salute is a decision you make before you need it, and she had made it, and she kept it all the way down. She drove back to Virginia alone the next day, with the medal in the passenger seat beside her in its case, and the spring coming up green along the highway. She did not go inside when she got home. She went around the back to the range in the long gold light of the late afternoon, and she sat down on the firing line, where she had sat 10,000 times, and she opened the M14's case in her lap. The rifle lay in its bed of foam, old and repaired, and refinished, the hairline crack above the grip with its own history written in the grain. The iron sights original, no rail, no scope, no compensation for any error a person might make, only bone and muscle and discipline, only the steadiness you decide on before the moment arrives. In the lid behind its thin strip of contact paper, replaced 3 times across the years the photograph. Sergeant First Class William Thornton, young and straight in his dress uniform, looking directly into the camera with the expression of a man who believed in what he was doing and understood exactly what it might cost. She took the silver star out of its case. She looked at it for a long time, and then she did the only thing that made any sense to do with it, the thing she had known she would do since the moment the general closed her fingers around it. She fixed it inside the lid of the rifle case beside the photograph, where it would ride with the M14 to every range she ever shot for the rest of her life, so that the medal and the man and the rifle and the discipline would always travel together, the way they had always belonged together, the way they had never actually been separate, no matter how long the institution had tried to keep them apart. She closed the case. She did not latch it yet. She sat in the gold light and looked at the tree line her father had looked at on 1,000 evenings, not talking about Hugh City, not talking about what he was owed, just being present in the life he'd come home to live. He had told her once that there were rare moments when everything you had ever learned and practiced and survived stopped being separate things and became one thing, when the shooter and the rifle and the wind in the distance all became parts of a single conversation happening below language. Those are the moments, he'd said, where you find out what you actually are. She had found out what she was. She had found out on a range in Coronado in a storm that broke every system but hers. And she had found out again on a parade ground in Washington, holding a piece of metal that 58 years and a 3-star admiral had tried to keep from ever existing. And she was finding out one more time now, in the quiet on the range her father built, with his rifle across her knees and his medal in the lid, and his voice, she could hear it clearly. After all these years, clearer than it had been since she was 24, somewhere in the place below, thought where he had put himself on purpose, one lesson at a time, so that he would always be findable when she needed him and never lost when she didn't. She latched the case. She stood up, and in the last of the light, the way she had every night since she was 24 years old, quietly in the private language of 2 people, one of whom was no longer present in any form, except the most permanent one, she said the things she always said. "Got it done, Dad?" The tree line did not answer. It never had. But for the first time in 58 years, the record was true, and the names were written down, and the medal was where it belonged. And somewhere on a parade ground, the echo of his name was still settling into the silence. And 3 old men who were alive because of him had risen to salute a man who never asked them to. Some legacies are buried by the people who fear them. They are buried carefully by people with signatures and authority and a great deal to lose if the truth is allowed to stand up straight. But the ones worth keeping do not stay buried because the truth is patient in exactly the way that a sniper is patient. It waits for the wind to cycle through to the one moment it can trust, and then it does not miss. It found its moment in a daughter, in a rifle, in a letter carried for half a century, and a scorecard that could not be unmade. William Thornton held a position when everything around it was falling apart, and he did not move. 58 years later, neither did she. And the moment when it finally came found out what they had both chosen long before in the quiet, on a range behind a house in Virginia, and had kept all the way down to the end.